Yeah, no, it's by Sondheim, side by side by side. It's got that line in it, parallel lines that meet. You know, like the title of this episode we're about to record. Yeah, I mean, no, it's a great song. I mean, I suggested it way back at the beginning that we use this one for the theme song. Okay, if you're watching this, you probably want your writing to sound better, to sound smarter. Parallelism or parallel structure is one of the easiest things you can learn to really make your writing sound more elevated, to make you sound smarter. Well, I'm not going to say smarter than you really are, but to make you really sound as smart as you actually are. Parallel structure or parallelism is saying the same kind of thing using the same grammatical form. Basically, the idea is that in your writing, you want to set a pattern and then you want to follow that pattern. You want to stick to that pattern. If you set a pattern and then break it, you'd better have a really good reason, because otherwise you don't sound smart at all. You sound like you are writing carelessly. Before we get too deep into parallelism, I want to take a moment to review some things about conjunctions. You might remember way back in series 1, that was me right there. I was so young then. I talked about FANBOYS, for and nor, but, yet, or, and so. I just said those kind of out of order, but this is like take number 440 and I'm not going to do it again. Those are what we call coordinating conjunctions. They take two ideas that are approximately equal and they bring them together. They coordinate these things. And if we're going to talk about coordinated conjunctions, we need to talk for a second about the Oxford comma, sometimes called the serial comma. 99.9% of the planet does not care one way or the other about the Oxford comma. The other 0.1% would probably tear each other to pieces if they were stuck on an island together. It's because there are people who are very, very much in favor of it and people who are very, very, very opposed to it. I personally prefer using the Oxford comma or the serial comma, and what it is, it's the comma that goes before the last item, before the conjunction and the last item in a list of 3 or more things. In addition to being a very hot topic of conversation on the interwebs, it's also a source of delight in terms of memes. Here's my favorite one about Rachel Ray. But if we're going to talk about parallelism and we're going to talk about coordinating conjunctions, we need to talk about that serial comma. For me, I believe that comma needs to be there. And by putting it there, you are going to make your parallelism that much more evident to your readers. As a mentor text for this episode, I'm going to be referring to a story from the Washington Post a couple years ago now called the Cobalt Pipeline. It's about the mineral cobalt and how it gets from the ground to your cell phone. Spoiler alert, there's some shady stuff going on. But here is a sentence found in that text. American companies attempt to verify that any tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold they use is obtained from mines free of militia control in the Congo region. Now, looking at that, you can see that there is a comma before the and at the end of that list. I added it. The Washington Post style guide, because every newspaper has its own style guide that it follows. The Washington Post style guide does not believe in it, but I do. Notice that there's just one conjunction in that list, the and that I put the comma next to. And that's as it should be. That's parallel, because it would sound really weird if you wrote something like this. American companies attempt to verify that any tin and tungsten, tantalum, and gold they use is obtained from mines free of militia control in the Congo region. That extra and there between tin and tungsten, that doesn't add anything. It complicates the list and it throws it out of parallel. And that's the first thing to remember about parallelism and coordinated conjunctions. Just one conjunction and just at the end of your list. Unless, you knew there would have to be an unless, right? Unless you want to put a conjunction between every term in your list. So rather than the one at the end plus another one or two random ones in there, you very deliberately choose to put a conjunction in between every term. And here's what that sentence about cobalt, well, not about cobalt, about the other minerals, here's what that sentence would sound like. American companies attempt to verify that any tin and tungsten and tantalum and gold they use is obtained from mines free of militia control in the Congo region. Now, using and in between every term on that list, it literally makes that list longer. And the effect that you can create by doing so is that the list is longer than it really is. You're drawing attention, as a writer, you're drawing your reader's attention to the length and the substantial amount of stuff that's contained in that list. That's a very deliberate choice to make. You could also make, quite literally, the opposite choice, where instead of all conjunctions, or instead of just the one conjunction at the end, you go no conjunctions at all. Here's what that sentence would sound like. American companies attempt to verify that any tin, tungsten, tantalum, gold they use is obtained from mines free of militia control in the Congo region. Now that doesn't sound quite right, but there are many cases where you can do a list like that with no conjunctions at all. It's particularly effective if you're making a list of prepositional phrases or perhaps even subordinate clauses. Consider that. Think about that. Now these two techniques, besides just the normal regular technique of putting one conjunction at the end of the list, these techniques have technical names. Using no conjunctions at all is called asyndeton, a prefix a meaning not, and the technique of using all conjunctions is called polysyndeton, with the prefix poly meaning many. Now, there's probably never going to be a situation in your life where you absolutely must positively remember those two terms. Maybe someday on Jeopardy, and you'll send me part of your winnings because you owe it all to me. But for the most part, you don't need to know polysyndeton, asyndeton. What you need to know is that these techniques are available to you as a writer. They're going to achieve a different effect when you are writing your list. And you also need to be aware that other writers will use these techniques. So if you're doing an analysis, you can look for or notice when there is asyndeton or polysyndeton and think about what effect was the author trying to achieve by using that technique, and does the author achieve that technique successfully? Now you've probably guessed that because the fanboy conjunctions have a technical name and it's coordinating conjunctions, you probably guessed that there are lots of other kinds of conjunctions. Previously in this very series, we talked about like subordinating conjunctions, for example. But there's another set of conjunctions that I think it's important to know. They are called correlative conjunctions, not coordinating, but correlative, because they correlate one part of a sentence with another. Correlative conjunctions always work in pairs. The fanboys, they work alone. Subordinating conjunctions, they work alone. Conjunctive adverbs, they work alone. But these correlative conjunctions have to be used in pairs. You are, in fact, probably very familiar with the most common of the correlative conjunction pairs, and that's either or and its negative cousin, neither nor. But those are not the only correlative conjunctions, not the only conjunctions that always work in pairs. You've got things like whether or, and if then, just as and so too, and one of my favorites, not only, but also. When you're using the correlative conjunctions like that, again, you want to think about how can you make sure that your writing is parallel, because if you set a pattern and you break that pattern without a good reason to, you're not going to sound very smart. Sentences that use pairs of correlative conjunctions are often sentences that will trip up young writers because you will feel like you're starting something new, but in reality, you're just halfway through something that was already started. So you want to make sure that both halves of the sentence, both parts of the correlative conjunctions, what follows, match. To look at an example, I will again go to the Cobalt Pipeline. But Chen, Huayu's president, said it is the proper action, not only for the company, but also for the Congolese miners. Okay, you haven't read the story yet, you should, it's linked below, I think I forgot to say that before. But from context, you can figure out Chen is a guy, Huayu is his company, they buy cobalt from the miners in the Congo. And what you can see there is the way the writer puts this. Chen is not directly quoted, but the way the writer puts this is parallel, because what follows the not only matches what follows the but also. For the company, for the Congolese miners. It's the exact same setup of a prepositional phrase, in fact, for the blank, on both sides. If we wanted to screw that up, we could. It would be pretty easy. It would look like this. But Chen, Huayu's president, said it is the proper action not only for the company, but also it is proper for the miners. Okay, you see how that end of the sentence, there's nothing grammatically wrong with it per se, but it doesn't match what's in the first half. And that's why you've got to be on the lookout for parallelism problems in sentences with these correlative conjunctions. Another place where students or young writers and experienced writers have trouble with parallelism is often in using verbs or using verbals like gerunds, participles, infinitives. If you don't know what those are, I'm going to link to some resources below about them. But it's also in other things like verb tense. If you start out writing in the past tense, you stay in the past tense. You could pick any sentence at random from the Cobalt Pipeline and the sentence tense or the verb tense is going to match in that sentence because it has been professionally written and professionally edited. In fact, here's one. But the problems remained starkly evident when the Post journalists visited mining operations in the Congo this summer. Okay, two verbs, remained and visited. Those are both in the past tense. It matches. There's a pattern established and a pattern continued. We could screw that up for them. But the problems remain starkly evident when Post journalists are visiting mining operations in Congo this summer. What? Like, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Verb tense is easy, you were thinking. And I don't know, it maybe is for you. It isn't for every student I've ever taught. But here's something that's less easy. Gerunds. A gerund is a verb form, always ends in ing, what we call the present participle. Again, I'm throwing around terms that you could know, but it's not the worst thing in the world if you don't. But a gerund is always used as a noun, a word like walking, running, swimming, eating, voting. Those can all be nouns, and they're called gerunds because they're action words that are being used as a noun. Let's take a look at a sentence that uses gerunds in parallel from the Cobalt Pipeline. Pyers also said Apple is committed to working with Huayu Cobalt to clean up the supply chain and to addressing the underlying issues such as extreme poverty that result in harsh work conditions and child labor. Now you probably heard, because I tried to emphasize it as I was reading, to working and to addressing. Those are both parallels. They're objects of the preposition. They're both parallel gerunds being used in that sentence. We could take it out of parallel by making one of those not a gerund anymore. Pyers also said Apple is committed to working with Huayu Cobalt to clean up the supply chain and also must address the underlying issues such as extreme poverty that result in harsh work conditions and child labor. So what you end up with there is two halves of the sentence that are formatted in a different way. Must address versus to working into the first half of the sentence. And it doesn't match. The first half of the sentence sets a pattern and the second half doesn't follow it. That's out of parallel. Another common source of parallel problems comes when students are trying to use prepositions or articles or helping verbs introducing a list of things that all are objects of the same preposition, or that all would have the same article on them, or that would all have the same helping verb to go with it. What you want to make sure is that when you're writing such a list, you put the preposition or the article or the helping verb at the beginning, and then after that, none. You just have the list, probably with a comma conjunction at the end of the list. Unless, because you knew there would be an unless you want to use that preposition, helping verb, or article in front of every single term on your list. This time, rather than a sentence from the text, because I couldn't find one that was exactly right for this example, I'm just going to write a sentence about the text. I would say this. The Cobalt Pipeline presents its story through text, images, and video. There's a list of 3 ways that the Cobalt Pipeline presents its story. And at the beginning of that is the single preposition through. Otherwise, it's just that list. But I could have written this. The Cobalt Pipeline presents its story through text, through images, and through video. See there, I've used the preposition through 3 times, one for each of the 3 ways that the story does present its ideas. What I should not do is mix and match, something like this. The Cobalt Pipeline presents its story through text, images, and through video. See, that's where I set the pattern. The pattern was preposition at the beginning and then not, except I threw in a preposition at the end. I broke the pattern. That's not good writing. I'll give you another example. I actually basically the same sentence, but this time using parallelism with articles instead of a preposition. To prepare to talk about the Cobalt Pipeline, I checked the text, images, and video. So there, the article the before the whole list, but not anywhere else in the list. I could also have gone with before every item on the list. To prepare to talk about the Cobalt Pipeline, I checked the text, the images, and the video. There you go, parallel. And finally, setting a pattern and keeping that pattern being parallel with phrases, clauses, or even entire sentences in a row. Here's a sample sentence from the Cobalt Pipeline. But how such serious problems could persist for so long, despite frequent warning signs, illustrates what can happen in hard-to-decipher supply chains. When they are mostly unregulated, low price is paramount, and the trouble occurs in a distant, tumultuous part of the world. Again, I tried to emphasize it in my reading, but there are 3 clauses right in a row at the end of that sentence. It starts with they are, low price is, and trouble occurs. So those are all clauses, and they all begin with the subject and present tense verb. There's a pattern set, there's a pattern kept. It's parallel. I could break that pattern. But how such serious problems could persist for so long, despite frequent warning signs, illustrates what can happen in hard-to-decipher supply chains when they are mostly unregulated, way too cheap, and they are in a troubled, distant, tumultuous part of the world. So rather than the zip, zip, zip of the clauses with their subject and present tense verb, we get this jumble of unrelated, unparalleled fragments and clauses at the end of that sentence. It's ugly, it's bad writing, it's not parallel. I said that parallelism can occur not just within a sentence in terms of the phrases and the clauses, but also among sentences in a row. I want to show you 2 consecutive sentences from the Cobalt Pipeline that, believe it or not, actually break parallel. They are not parallel to each other, and I'll talk about that on the other side. 13 cobalt miners were killed in September 2015 when a dirt tunnel collapsed in Mabaya, near the Zambia border. 2 years ago, 16 diggers were killed by landslides in Kawama, followed months later by the deaths of 15 diggers in an underground fire in Kolwezi. I may be pronouncing those places wrong, and, as I said, shady stuff. So what you've got here are 2 sentences, and the first part of the second sentence matches the first sentence in terms of, cobalt miners were killed. But then the second half of the second sentence doesn't match at all. So if it were me, and I'm not a professional, I do not work for the Washington Post, I do not necessarily aspire to work for the Washington Post, but if I were editing or writing that story, I would change it. I would make it 3 sentences, and I would make it parallel, like this. 13 cobalt miners were killed in September 2015 when a dirt tunnel collapsed in Mabaya near the Zambia border. 2 years ago, 16 diggers were killed by landslides in Kawama. Months later, 15 diggers were killed in an underground fire in Kolwezi. So it turns from 2 sentences into 3, but each one of those 3 sentences follows the pattern established by the first. And that brings us to the end of this episode on parallelism. I want to say, yes, I threw a lot of technical terms at you in this one, from correlative conjunctions to gerunds and infinitives and participles, all that kind of stuff. Asyndeton, polysyndeton. If you didn't catch those, if you have no idea right now at this moment after having just watched the whole thing what those mean, that's okay. You don't need to know the technical term of every single thing that you do, but you do need to know what it means to write in parallel. You do need to recognize when it is a good idea for you to do that in your writing because it is academic or because you do want to sound smart. You need to recognize when other authors are doing it, or if they fail to do it, like we saw in that last example. Parallelism is an important technique to know, to do, and to recognize. I can't put it any other way. When we talk about syntax, parallelism is just one of those things that it's a given. It has to be done. I'll see you for the next one.